Good afternoon, everybody. For those online and those present in person, it was wonderful meeting some of our very loyal members of our audience in person in Los Angeles today. Welcome to both our esteemed audiences tonight, to the hundreds of LA residents joining us in person at the Skirball Cultural Center, and to the thousands who are with us via Zoom from cities, as you heard, around the United States and beyond. We are pleased to bring you part two in a series designed to help us understand the results of midterm elections. Tonight, we will do this two separate panels. The first will feature the results of the national elections, and the second will feature the results in California, a state in which 1 of every 10 Americans resides. Thank you to all of our panelists, the amazing Larry Mantle, and especially KPCC, our local NPR station, for partnering with us on this program. America at a Crossroads is a joint venture between Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc. Thanks as always to our leadership team, which in addition to me and my buddy here, David Lehrer, includes former Congressman Mel Levine, Xavier Oslovsky, Rabbi Ken Chazen, and Caroline Kelly. Tonight represents the 135th week of Executive America at a Crossroads weekly programs. Next week is Thanksgiving, and there will be no program. But starting on November 30th, resume programming with esteemed diplomat and longtime president of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haass. Followed by the next week is Juliet Kayyem, former Assistant Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, followed then by Robin Wright, noted scholar and an authority on Iran and the Middle East. And finally, finishing off December with Jim Rutenberg of the New York Times on the topic of foreign and domestic election meddling. If you are not signed up to be on our America at a Crossroads email list, so you get all of our announcements and our registration links and our Zoom links, we will tell you later on by email how to sign up, because some of you may not have signed up for our email list, but you'll be getting an email whether you're in person or on Zoom to be able to do that. Lots to talk about in these very fast-moving and often turbulent times. And now my buddy, David Lehrer.
Thank you, Janice. It's the first time in 2.5 years we've been next to each other and I'm able to say thank you and say thank you very much.
You too.
I'm David Lehrer, President of Community Advocates, and we're delighted to partner with KPCC and Larry Mantle in presenting a special program, America at a Crossroads. After 2.5 years on Zoom, it's great to finally meet and greet in person some of our local viewers. Janice mentioned the program scheduled through December. We have an equally solid lineup in January, including the New York Times' David Brooks, America's most seasoned Middle East diplomat, Ambassador Dennis Ross, and former ambassador to Moscow, Mike McFaul. He is, you may recall, is the man who Putin wanted Trump to send back to Moscow for a trial. I now have the pleasure of introducing our host for the next 2 hours, KPCC's Larry Mantle. Larry has hosted his flagship news program, Air Talk, for nearly 40 years, the longest running daily talk program in Los Angeles. He's a longtime friend, an invaluable source of reason and illumination on the Southern California media scene. He's the perfect person to host a thoughtful and in-depth analysis of what transpired over the past 10 days. Larry, the program is all yours.
Thank you. And good evening. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Appreciate that very much. And Janice and David, thank you so much. In case you wonder where they're coming from, they're at a secret location in the building. And if heaven forbid there be a cataclysmic meteor strike, they will make it. We won't, because they're way down. But great to have you with us tonight. I have been part of America at a Crossroads for 2.5 years. These extraordinary programs that bring together thousands of viewers from across the United States, and as you heard, as Janice described the locations around the world as well. Weekdays, I'm at the studios of KPCC in Pasadena, where I host the daily interview call-in program, Air Talk. And what's so wonderful about being able to bring these organizations together is the Wednesday nights that I often spend moderating these conversations, and the audience there now comes together with the KPCC audience. And this was actually suggested by one of our KPCC trustees, Nancy Stark, who recommended we do this as a joint program, and I'm so happy that she made that recommendation. So again, my appreciation, Jews United for Democracy and Justice, Community Advocates, Inc., and KPCC for co-presenting tonight's program at the Skirball Cultural Center in the Sepulveda Pass of Los Angeles. Let me introduce our distinguished panel tonight in conversation. First, joining us is NPR political correspondent Mara Liasson. Mara, great to have you with us this evening. Clarence Page is Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for the Chicago Tribune. And also with us, Robert Shrum, director of the USC Dornsife Center for the Political Future. So as we begin tonight's program, President Trump is expected in about an hour to speak and to announce another run for president. Republicans poised to take a slim majority of the House of Representatives. Kevin McCarthy of Bakersfield has won today's vote for leader of the Republican Party, potentially the Speaker of the House. And we have Florida Senator Rick Scott telling folks he's looking to take Senate minority leadership from Mitch McConnell. We'll talk about all of this and much, much more. Thank you all so much for being with us. Let me start with you, Mara, and ask you about, first of all, Trump and his announcement this evening. Despite the fact it would appear that his endorsements, with the exception of J.D. Vance, went nowhere.
Well, no, a bunch of people he endorsed in red states won. Ted Budd won. No, he has. The problem is that his endorsements in states that Biden won, or battleground states, those candidates lost. And now he's considered to be a loser by the conservative pundit class, the donor class, and most of the congressional leadership, who now are finally willing to say out loud what they've been saying in private for years. He lost the election of 2018, 2020, then the specials in 2021, and here we are now again, 2022. Consider a drag on the ticket. Now, what we've seen in the past, after Access Hollywood, after the January 6th insurrection, is Republicans are willing for a brief moment to criticize him, but then because the base is so loyal to him, they keep, decide that they're not going to talk about that anymore. They scuttle down to Mar-a-Lago and good graces like Kevin McCarthy did, or Lindsey Graham. So what we're going to find out, I think, soon is how strong is Donald Trump's hold on the Republican base, on actual Republican voters. The way he won in 2016, the way he got the nomination, which is against a crowded field, he could do that again. That's why some Republicans thought he would be making a big mistake to announce now. Why not wait till the field fills up and they can all fight each other and he can win with 30% or 40% of the vote like he did in 2016. Now, this time, Republicans might have learned their lesson and say, hey, we're going to all coalesce around Ron DeSantis from the beginning. Not going to pay any attention to Mike Pompeo or Mike Pence. We don't know, but that's one of the things we're going to find out. And Donald Trump, as it turns out, was on the ballot. There's a lot of talk that he wasn't on the ballot, but yes, he was. He helped Joe Biden turn this election from a referendum on the incumbent party to a choice between Republican extremists and the Democrats. And I just want to say one thing before we go on to something else. This really shocked me. If you didn't know the results of the election, you were just told about the exit polls, and then you had to guess who won. Exit polls showed that more, what? Hello? Oh, the exit polls show that the Republican Party was trusted more to handle crime and immigration and foreign policy. Inflation was the #1 issue. Biden's approval ratings were pretty bad, and they still voted for Democrats. That's how crazy this election was, and it really has challenged a lot of our assumptions about all the things we thought we knew, all the historical rules that worked till they stopped working. So I think we're all learning a lot of lessons.
Yeah, and Clarence, I wanted to ask, so we have a president who has a comparatively low approval rating, and what should have, according to historical patterns, been a big midterm for the
I think there were other unconventional factors that made a difference here. And by the way, this is the beginning of the postmortems that we're going to hear for the next few months as to why the red tsunami didn't appear, and why the Dobbs turned out to be, I think, a bigger deal than was expected. Dobbs went up and down. Dobbs being the Supreme Court abortion decision, of course, that undid Roe v. Wade. At first, it was thought, oh boy, there's going to be a big backlash against Republicans because of Dobbs. And then other events came along. Dobbs kind of faded into the background, and we started hearing more and more about crime and inflation and Joe Biden's approval ratings, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's why a lot of people were hit by surprise, because we found a very big turnout of young voters. Bigger than expected, young independents for whom the abortion issue was much more important than had been expected. I think we're seeing a new generation gap in politics today. The sort of young people that turned out to vote against the war back in my day, back in the 60s, today they're turning out to vote in favor of choice. And I think there's a lot of different hidden votes. I heard Frank Luntz talking today about how there was I love to hear Bob Strum speak to this, how there were a lot of people who said they were voting for the Republican, and then by the time they got to the polls, they didn't. He said something like 8 or 9%. When they got to the polls, they voted for somebody else in order to send a signal, depending on whether they went to the right or to the left. There are a lot of little factors like this that we're going to see more attention paid to in coming weeks.
Yeah, Bob, you have been involved in so many elections, you've been in the trenches for these. What's your sense of what happened here, and how much was it the Dobbs decision, and how much was it Democrats coming out in an effort to support democracy that fueled the turnout?
Yeah, first let me say I've been very proud to be part of this series, and I'm also pleased that in an earlier episode I said I thought Democrats would hold the Senate and probably narrowly lose the House, which I think is what happened. In answer to, by the way, what Clarence just said, Frank Luntz had absolutely no empirical evidence for what he said today. I mean, what he's trying to do is explain away his prediction just before the election. The Republicans would have a bigger majority in the House than they got in 1994, and that they would take at least 54 seats in the Senate. He was clearly wrong. He's acknowledged that. And then he said, but wait a minute, I have a reason. 8 or 9% of people changed their minds when they went into the polling place. It's preposterous. I think three things were really critical here. The effect of the Dobbs decision. And in some ways, what was happening was the media were running one campaign and the electorate were conducting another campaign. It's not as if women or young people suddenly decided they didn't care about Dobbs anymore or the reversal of Roe v. Wade, but the media wanted a new and different story. And I've seldom seen a herd mentality that was as powerful as the herd mentality before this election. I mean, it didn't matter if the polls that you could trust, as distinct from the partisan polls that flooded the averages, actually said this was going to be very close. People just didn't pay attention to it. They're talking about a red tsunami. Number two, I think Donald Trump insisted on inserting himself in this election. And I mean, he's doing a last minute rally with Carrie Lake in Arizona. I mean, first of all, it was stupid of her to do it, but he insisted on doing it. In fact, J.D. Vance didn't want him to come to Ohio. And so he went to Ohio and he attacked Vance during the rally, saying Vance had to kiss his ass to get his endorsement. Thirdly, I think Biden, who was derided in some quarters for doing it, was absolutely right to give a speech about the future of democracy. I think that was on the ballot. I think people believed it was on the ballot and they cared about it. I think when you put those three factors together, you can explain why this was such an unusual election. The best election for a Democratic president in his first term since John F. Kennedy in 1962, after the Cuban Missile Crisis. the first election since 1934, when the incumbent president in his first midterm didn't lose a single state legislative chamber. In fact, Democrats gained state legislative chambers.
All right, we have our first question from one of our viewers, Sid, who asks, what do you think will happen with the Georgia runoff? Will white voter turnout be down? Mara?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that now that the Georgia runoff is not determinative, it changes the dynamic. The Nevada Senate race decided whether Republicans or Democrats would control the Senate. The Georgia Senate runoff is going to determine whether Democrats or Joe Manchin control the Senate. But the point is the Democrats have a majority no matter what. And the question is, will white, rural, conservative voters who voted for Kemp for governor, will they bother coming out again to vote for Herschel Walker, scandal-plagued Herschel Walker, when nothing much is hanging in the balance? The Democrats are going to have a majority anyway. I think that African-American voters are going to be really fired up. You saw this the last time in the Georgia runoffs. The only difference is you're not going to have Donald Trump saying the election was rigged, your vote didn't count, and suppressing the vote. I don't think he's going to go to Georgia and do that again. I mean, you never know. But so, look, it's very hard to make predictions, especially about the future. And we certainly learned that this time. But in the past, the leader in Georgia, when you go into a runoff, the person who's leading generally ends up as the winner. And it's interesting because this runoff system is a vestige of Jim Crow, and it was designed so that a candidate with less than 50% of the vote could win, so that no black candidate could win. And what's so interesting is now we see an election that requires 50% or more as something good for democracy. We can talk about that later with ranked choice voting in top 2 primaries. But I guess if you'd have to ask me for a prediction, I'd predict it's Warnock.
Bruce asked, what impact did Liz Cheney have on the election results? Clarence?
Well, it's a good question. I presume you mean the January 6th commission committee and their hearings, because I think that's where the democracy question comes in. The argument was made very well by the January 6th committee. The evidence was laid out. The case was made for further investigations, at least, and sort of why this is important. Americans shouldn't have to be reminded of why democracy is important. January 6th kicked off a big and I hope healthy debate as to why the Capitol matters, why the election process and vote counting matters. I think Jen, just to single out Liz Cheney, she performed beautifully at the committee, and she made the case very well. I'm doing a plug for my fellow Illinoisan, Adam Kinzinger, who just got gerrymandered out of a seat, which he would have probably lost anyway, the same way Liz Cheney did, because the primary voters, Illinois primary Republicans, all are heavily Trumpified. Whether they believe in Trump, they believe in the party, and they see the two as inseparable. But I think Liz Cheney certainly held up a standard that Americans all should appreciate as we all take a hard look at what a democracy means and why we need to have it.
Larry, can I add one thing to that? Liz Cheney actually went and campaigned for a number of candidates. They were all Democrats. The people she campaigned for won. She made a very tough ad in Arizona, for example, asking people not to vote for Carrie Lake. It's the closest possible thing to a female clone of Donald Trump, except she's more polished. So I think Liz Cheney contributed through the January 6th committee to the outcome here, but she contributed very directly. And if you had told 5 years ago, be out campaigning for Democrats, I would have been stunned. I would never have believed the thought you were living in an alternative universe.
Maybe we
Bob Trump would be speaking well of her.
back to the Dobbs decision. In Kentucky, Voters defeated the constitutional amendment specifying that there was no right to abortion. Kansas voted down its abortion ban. So even in highly conservative, we're seeing people coming out to support the right to abortion. Bob, how much of that is going to be a fueling factor looking even 2 years down the road?
I think this issue is here to stay. I think the Supreme Court unleashed the dogs of war on this issue with a decision that nobody ever expected. Well, I guess we did kind of expect it after Amy Coney Barrett. But look, I can't recall a situation where the court has taken away a fundamental right that's been around for 50 years. And I can tell you my students at USC were really motivated by this decision, most of them, to go out and vote. And most of them then voted for Democrats. If you look at some of the data that came out, John Della Volpe at the Institute of Politics at Harvard does a very extensive survey of young people. And before the election, he said about 40% of these 18 to 29-year-olds are going to vote, and they're going to vote 2-1 Democratic. Well, he was pretty close to exactly right on the money. And the big thing that motivated them was A, the Dobbs decision, B, Trump, and C, the threat to democracy. But if you look at Michigan, in the exit polls that Mara was talking about, I believe abortion was the highest issue in Michigan. And in Michigan, you didn't have a red tsunami, you had a blue tsunami, where Democrats took every statewide office. The Constitution was amended to protect reproductive rights. And Democrats, for the first time since 1984, took both houses of the state legislature.
Can I add something?
Laura,
Bob
yes,
just said? Yeah. First of all, that's really interesting because I thought only 27% of 18 to 29-year-olds turned out this time. They voted 70-20 Democrat, but I didn't think their number was as high as 40. Maybe he's saying 18 to 35 or something.
He probably is.
Because the big problem is that young voters vote overwhelmingly for Democrats, but they don't turn out in huge percentages.
They turned out in a big enough percentage that their margin canceled votes of people over 65.
Well, no, and now the challenge,
and that's what John was right about.
And that's what the challenge for Democrats is, to build on that next time. But can I say something about abortion?
Yeah, Mara.
Pundits got so many things wrong this time. Pollsters didn't get this wrong. If you get rid of the partisan polls and you educate people what margin of error means, the pollsters were not off, but the pundits were. And what Bob said earlier about this instinct, conventional wisdom stampede, I totally agree with him. I have never been in an election cycle when it's been worse than this. And what we learned is that voters have more nuance and they're more complicated thinkers than we thought they were. For instance, abortion would wax and wane as the top issue, but it meant something bigger than just abortion. It meant the opposite of Republican extremism. It was kind of in there with all these other things, with January 6th and with Trump and election denialism. It all got mixed together and made voters, even the ones who cared the most about inflation and didn't like Joe Biden, they went into the booth and pushed Democrat.
We hear about the power of the suburban white woman voter. Was that the case here?
Yeah, I think that, they're the ones who turned against Trump in 2018. There was big question. They were swinging back to Republicans because of inflation, and not enough of them did.
What do we know about Latino turnout, particularly in states like Florida and Texas and here in California? There was so much talk about there being a move of Latinos towards conservatism, towards Republicans. Did we see much of that? Bob?
It's certainly true in Florida, where Latinos, and they're not a single block of voters, by the way. Latinos in Florida are primarily Venezuelan, Cuban, and they're Puerto Rican. And there was a movement among Puerto Ricans toward the Republicans in Florida. There was somewhat of a movement in Texas. And this is a controversial question, but a lot of Latino analysts will tell you that in states outside of those places, there wasn't much of a change with Latinos. The truth is that Catherine Cortez Masto got reelected in Nevada because she got very heavy Latino support. I suspect that when we slice and dice the data, we'll find out the same thing happened in Arizona with Mark Kelly.
In Florida, weren't we seeing Cuban voters, particularly younger Cuban voters, moving toward the Democratic Party? So this would seem to be a reversal of that, Miami area vote and how it seemed to be moving.
Well, if you might have had some younger Cubans moving toward Democrats, but the Republicans carried Miami-Dade County. Ron DeSantis carried Miami-Dade County. And if you talk to a lot of Democrats right now, they're going to say that Florida is the state that always breaks their hearts, and they're not going to see it as a kind of purple state anymore. They're beginning to think of it as a red state. And that may in fact be the case.
But it also, the other thing of it, look, there were so many contradictory things. Michigan had a blue tsunami. Florida had a red tsunami. I think that what happened in Florida was a testament to the Democrats giving up. Apparently, from what I've heard, the Democratic Party in Florida barely exists. And if you want to put, if some billionaire out there wants a good 10-year project, they could rebuild, the Florida Democratic Party. It happened in Colorado. You have to do the work. You have to build the infrastructure. And right now, I think they're in a very deep hole. But I think the utter collapse of the Democratic Party in Florida was one of the biggest stories this cycle.
Like the collapse of the Republican Party over the past decade in California. Clarence, I wanted to ask you about Ron DeSantis and the big night that he had. And if there was no Donald Trump, you would say he is head and shoulders the front runner above others in the Republican pact. But your thoughts about DeSantis and how he matches up against Trump in Republican primaries?
Well, someone asked Joe Biden a question like that about this competition emerging on the right between DeSantis and Donald Trump. And Joe said, if I'm wrong as far as the direct quote, but it was sort of like, it'll be fun to watch them fight, essentially. And reminds me of an old editorial board expression, let's you and them fight. But that's what's happening on the right as far as DeSantis and Trump are concerned. DeSantis is committing the ultimate sin in Trump land, which is to challenge Donald Trump. But he's got a lot in his favor, certainly for Florida. How well does DeSantis play to the rest of the country? We're all finding that out now gradually. But he's a very, he obviously, as was mentioned earlier, he's got great appeal with the donor class and the folks who care about winning elections. Trump's got big appeal with folks on the right who care about ideology, care about making their point, whether it's with abortion or guns, etc. And so that this makes for a very a wonderful time for journalists and pundits as we analyze what this does all mean and who is going to succeed in the end. But what we don't know, I think, as one who follows the horse race a lot, takes it seriously, it's going to be interesting to see how well DeSantis does play nationally. He's already got a foothold by playing the issues the way he has, whether it's CRT, critical race theory, or the other issues that are more on the ideological side that he's gotten a lot of mileage with, and which I don't agree with him on as a pundit, and the Democrats don't agree with him on, but they help to fire up the base. And so I think he's way out ahead.
For many people, base, it's that there are many Americans who feel that wokeism, as they call it, has gone too far, and they see this as someone who's really pushing back against what they see as
Let me say something very quickly about that. That's right. A lot of Americans think wokeism has gone too far. What the heck is wokeism? I say a lot of Americans don't like extremism, whether it's on the right or the left.
Yeah.
That's certainly what we saw with the backlash among voters against the Republicans this time around, because it was so linked to Trumpism. And I think Democrats have been missing a bet all along by not taking this so-called wokeism and so-called CRT debate. Yes, they're phony debates, but the public won't know that if you don't say it.
Well, I think, Clarence, I
Your
think in
campaign, et
fairness
cetera.
to conservative voters, I think what they'd say is that putting all issues through the prism of race is what they object to. They're making race, quiet, please, quiet. There are 5,000 people taking part in this program. So for you as an individual to put yourself above them isn't fair. So hold on, please. So Clarence, I mean, there would be people who say, could tell you very definitively what they don't like about how Democrats deal with race. Does DeSantis have the ability to tap into a critical mass there?
Well, I think he's already doing so, as you see, just like with the governor of Virginia, who really brought CRT in the headlines and became a culture warrior. He before known as more of a fiscal Republican, but he suddenly became a culture warrior to enough positive effect for his campaign that now it's spread through the rest of the party. And I think DeSantis is doing the same thing. When I say that these are phony issues, I know CRT, for example, critical race theory. Years ago, I was speaking with graduate students about that. It's a graduate level course. There's nothing to do with what people are really talking about. They are talking about what you mentioned, the extremism. That's what troubles them. It troubles them that their kids are going to be taught in school lessons about race without them knowing it and without connection to what their beliefs are at home. And they don't think kids or whether the schools are be doing that without their full approval. It's a culture war issue. And Democrats need to understand that these are the issues that hit people where they live, and the party needs to deal with that directly and not as an election.
Make the point the party's gone too woke, as they put it. So that's not just a Republican critique of Democratic Party. Karen asks, why did Democrats do so poorly in New York, at least in House races?
That's a great question. What happened in New York is the state Supreme Court struck down a partisan gerrymander. In other states, in red states, the state Supreme Court doesn't do that. They generally let partisan gerrymanders go through. So, you know, they were scrambling and you had Democrats in the same district, you know, fighting against each other. Maybe crime made a difference in New York the way it didn't in Pennsylvania. I'm interested to hear what Bob thinks about this. But if the original redistricting had gone through, I don't think we would have seen the loss of so many seats in New York.
All right. Bob asks, if Biden decides not to run, who would be the likely Democratic nominee?
Well, first, let me just double back and say that I think Clarence is absolutely right. And I would say wokeism is a very powerful argument to the Republican base. It didn't prove in this election to be a very powerful argument to the public in general. And in fact, Glenn Youngkin, the governor of Virginia, whom you mentioned, Larry, who used this issue to help him win a year ago, went gallivanting around the country campaigning for candidates, most of whom lost. And he had 3 critical congressional races in the state that Republicans could win, and Democrats won 2 of those races. He wasn't paying attention to them. To get to your question, I've known Joe Biden for almost 50 years. When I first met him, he wanted to be president of the United States. I don't think he thought it would take that long to get there, but it did. And now that he's there, and by the way, for whatever you want to say about his approval ratings, which have been improving, whatever you want to say about his approval ratings, he has been legislatively, arguably, the most successful Democratic president since Lyndon Johnson in 1965. So he's not going to, if he's healthy, he's not going to walk away. And for all of the press, again, herd-fueled speculation about who's going to run if Biden doesn't run, the fact is, if Biden decides he's running, I don't think he will be seriously challenged by any other Democrat.
Yeah, and I think that
I
makes
agree
it,
with that.
might be Bob was also trying to be delicate with the question. If Joe Biden is not able to run in 2 years, what happens to the party then?
Well, there'll be a lot of people who will emerge. Kamala Harris will have an advantage. She'll have an advantage because of the position and importance of the South Carolina primary. Pete Buttigieg will, I think, almost certainly run. Gavin Newsom will run. I don't want to leave anybody out of this. Gretchen Whitmer is the big new star of the Democratic Party, and all the attention that's being paid to DeSantis, New York Times running a profile of his wife. I mean, she deserves that same kind of attention, because what she pulled off in that state was absolutely extraordinary. So I think those people would be among the folks who would be, but look, Congressman Ro Khanna might decide to run. He's a kind of heir to Bernie Sanders, but he's younger, he's incredibly bright, and he's very good talking about these economic issues, and has said the Democratic Party has to talk about them. All of that said, I don't think you'll see any of these people running against Joe Biden.
Yeah, if he runs, absolutely. Because, I mean, that would be a terrible message to send, to take on Joe Biden if he's, and you know, Gavin Newsom, of course, here in California talked about so much as a potential candidate. I can't imagine him taking on Joe Biden, though, to do it. Mara, your thoughts about the potential field, and do you think Newsom, if Joe Biden isn't running, would be one of the leading candidates?
I find it hard to believe that the Democratic Party that chose Joe Biden would not want someone relatively in that mold, a Gretchen Whitmer, a Midwestern governor. I think it's very hard to imagine a post-Biden field, because Democrats come and kind of scratch their heads when they think about who would be the obvious winner if Joe Biden wasn't at the top of the ticket. Not Kamala Harris, a lot of them say. Who else could take on Ron DeSantis and win? I think Gavin Newsom is an important figure, but I think it would be hard. I wonder what Bob thinks about this too. To nominate a California Democrat, I think that would be very tough for the Democrats.
Paul,
I mean, tough for them to think that that kind of Democrat could win.
Paul asks, how would Kevin McCarthy be able to govern if he is House Speaker with such a slim margin of error? The Freedom Caucus already making demands of him. Clarence?
Well, good question. Kevin McCarthy has his work cut out for him with this particular Republican caucus, because you got the Marjorie Taylor Greene wing. And I'm waiting to see if Miss Bobart there in Colorado might get reelected, or another cliffhanger. But McCarthy has got to pull the factions of his party together in much the same way that Joe Biden had to and has to manage his minority elements, like Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema pulling over to the right. That's going to be, I guess, in Joe Biden terms, fun to watch. But McCarthy, now his skills as a peacemaker and a coalition builder inside of his own party are going to be tested. And I don't know how he's going to do. So far, he's done a great job of running a daily anti-Democrat campaign, throwing slings and arrows at them. But now he's going to have to really govern if he gets that slot. It's not guaranteed to him. The slot, I mean.
We're going to take questions from our in-person audience here at the Skirball Cultural Center. For those of you that are watching virtually, we are, for the first time in the history of America at a crossroads, coming your way from an actual audience space, the Skirball Cultural Institution in the Sepulveda Pass of Los Angeles, between West Los Angeles and the San Fernando Valley. And we've got a few hundred people who are joining us here in the Skirball. Raise your hand if you have a question. Let's start this side of the room. We have anyone here with a hand? No? Okay, well, we'll just continue. We have someone right down here. Oh, we need a microphone. No one will hear you, I promise. Okay.
I heard on KPFK that Bernie Sanders was very, very active, although the media did not report it. And I'm wondering if the young people came out thanks to Bernie Sanders, because he was very popular when he was running against, you know.
Yeah, well, let's ask our who wants, Bob, you want to take that?
Well, first of all, if the media wasn't reporting it, and most young people weren't going to his rallies, because most people, even young people, don't go to political rallies, he can't be the reason that they turned out. I think that Dobbs, the presence of Trump, I mean, I've gone over this. I think those were the big motivators for young people. Some people talk about Bernie Sanders running again if Joe Biden doesn't. I think that's very unlikely. If Joe Biden doesn't run, people are going to say fairly or unfairly, it's because of his age. So what are you going to do? Run someone older? I doubt very much that that would happen.
Now, one other thing about the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, just an example, there was a Democrat who lost a Biden +9 district in Oregon, Jamie McLeod Skinner. She defeated a moderate Democrat and went on to lose against a Republican. I mean, that's just not a good scorecard for the Bernie Sanders wing of the party. And I don't think they can point to any other wins where a progressive Democrat prevailed over a moderate Democrat in the primary and went on to win like that.
All right, your question? Yes.
Yeah, hi. My question is about Georgia. It was such a close race. What's the effect of the Libertarian Party there? They're like 2%. Are they going to have, I couldn't find out, are they right or left? Where are they?
Well, libertarians are neither right or left, and they're both right and left. So,
and they fundamentally are a repository for people who don't like either of the major parties. They're going to go someplace else. They could be anywhere on the political spectrum. They tend to be somewhat anti-government, but they also tend to be socially liberal, if you want a coherent definition. But I think that probably goes too far.
so goes too far in.
It doesn't characterize all libertarians. A lot of the votes that go to libertarians are people who say, look at the Democrat, look at the Republican, or don't like the political system, aren't happy with the candidates they're given, so they vote libertarian.
Okay, not that they're truly libertarians. Yes, right here. Yes, sir.
Yeah, towards the end, the Democrats changed their message to trying to talk about inflation and other economic issues. Did they make a mistake in not staying focused on Dobbs?
No, well, I would say no. And I would also say that there were Democrats who did talk about economic issues. Seth Magaziner, who was running for Congress in Rhode Island, was behind in every poll. And about 2 or 3 weeks out, he began broadcasting a message that said fundamentally, inflation is due to price gouging by special interests, by the pharmaceutical companies, by the oil companies. Send me to Congress, and that's what I'm going to fight. But he never gave up on the choice issue. So I think Democrats probably could have used a little more component of an economic message. I think, and in fact, if the Democrats don't run on economics, then what are they about? I mean, it's supposed to be the party that stands up for ordinary folks. So you got to run on the economy. But I think it would have been a big mistake to walk away from Dobbs and Roe v. Wade.
Mara, you were going to say something about Democrats on the economy.
Well, I was just going to say, I don't think that they stopped talking about abortion at the end. I think the question was, should they have talked more about it? I think they talked a lot about it. But the point is, voters had a whole bunch of things they cared about, and they all reinforced each other. The economy maybe made them sour on the incumbents, but extremism, and abortion was the poster child for that, made them lean against the Republicans. So I think that the Democrats tried to have a pretty multifaceted message. And I think you'd be hard pressed to find evidence that they all decided to talk about one specific thing at the end instead of another.
I think also at the same time, by the way, Democrats had a problem pulling together a coherent message in this campaign. I heard that complaint from a lot of people, and I was quite surprised to say, personally gratified to see that they did. Well, the voters did it for them. The anti-Dobbs vote was largely like a grassroots uprising among a lot of young people, a lot of women, a lot of folks who were really psyched on that issue. But it wasn't like the party did that much to go out and beat the bushes for them. So I think there's something that can be learned from that. Bob's absolutely right that the party needs to have a better message on economics. J.D. Vance, who comes from the same hometown I do, I know that the problems he talked about in Hillbilly Elegy, his bestseller, and that motivated his campaign about reversing the flow of jobs out of the state, et cetera. Very basic hometown stuff that really came across very well, along with help from wealthy Republican donors. And he was able to surge to the front on that issue. Sherrod Brown has an excellent agenda on jobs and economics, and I'd like to see more from him here in the future. He's the other senator from Ohio and the only Democrat left in those high offices in that state.
Yes, your question.
What do you think the conclusion will be of the January 6th process? And given that the Trump base probably won't accept whatever it is, what kind of influence is it really going to have on our country?
That's a really good question. I think that they've written the first chapter for the history books of the insurrection. I think that January 6th hearings, although at the time we said, oh, look, the polls aren't showing any movement in Trump's approval rating after all these hearings. Well, yes, they did have an impact. January 6th, abortion, extremism, election denialism, all that went together in voters' minds. And I think that if Donald Trump started out this cycle as the 800-pound gorilla in the Republican Party, he ended up the cycle as the 700-pound gorilla. I mean, he's still pretty important, but the January 6 hearings did take a toll on him. I know they're going to have a report. They might have maybe another hearing or two before the Republicans shut the whole thing down when they take over in January. But I think the January 6th hearings will go down in history as being really important. And they will be I think, the definitive view of what happened on that day.
Stewart asks, might it be possible that a small number of GOP moderates might join with Democrats to actually get things done in Congress? Clarence.
Well, I think it depends on the issue, but there are some areas, some of which we've talked about, where both parties can work together. But as far as a massive outpouring of bipartisanship, I don't expect that. When you break down issues like inflation, the mammoth issues that involve a lot of different aspects of the economic frontier, they do better breaking them down into bite-sized issues and winning votes and winning bipartisan coalitions that way. The Congress is still the most divided, polarized it has been in memory. So I'm not expecting miracles.
Larry, can I add something to that?
Yes.
Look, we haven't talked about the lame duck Congress, except for Maura's reference to the January 6th hearings. I think you're going to see some bipartisan, either covertly or overtly, bipartisan action in the lame duck Congress. I think it is likely that there will be enough Republicans in the Senate to pass a bill that will codify same-sex marriage. And it's not, you can't write Obergefell straight into federal law, because the federal government can't order the states to do that, but it can order the states, for example, to recognize same-sex marriages that occurred in other states. And I think that will probably pass. I also think that Kevin McCarthy and Mitch McConnell secretly really want the Democrats to raise the debt limit and raise it beyond the 2024 election during the lame duck Congress. Now, they won't vote for it, but they're not going to stand in the way. They're not going to fight very hard, no matter what they say, because the extremes of their caucuses, especially in the House, want to use the debt ceiling as hold it hostage, say we won't pass or we won't raise the debt ceiling unless you agree to cut entitlements like Social Security and Medicare. And by the way, we might close the government down over this. Well, Newt Gingrich road tested that argument for the Republicans in the 1990s, and it's a disaster. So I think that that'll be the covert bipartisanship. And I think we might even see some overt bipartisanship, at least in the lame duck session.
What about codifying Roe?
I don't think they have the votes. I mean, I think Biden told the truth the other day. They don't have the votes. They could bring it to a vote, but they don't have the votes. But there may be a vote because—
In the Senate, you mean? If they don't,
yeah. But there may be a vote because often legislation is introduced and voted on when people know it's not going to pass, because it helps create a basis for argument in the
Yeah.
coming campaign. But if you're asking me, is there bipartisan support to codify Roe v. Wade? I don't think so. In fact, I'm sure there's not.
We have a question, let's see, right here. Yes, go right ahead.
Okay. Basically assuming that the Republicans win the House and Trump runs president, maybe he already decided to, and Biden stays in there, what would Biden's position be? What should he do? And what should the Democrats do to win in 2 years? Assuming it's already the election of.
Well, let's ask the man who's consulted so much on campaigns, Bob.
Well, first of all, they're going to confirm a lot of judges. For Biden, that's very important. He used to be chairman of the Judiciary Committee. Ron Klain was his chief of staff, was his chief deputy on that committee when he was running it. So they're going to confirm a lot of judges. Secondly, they're going to do everything they can through executive action. They're going to fight very hard on some of these court decisions. I mean, what is, in my view, an incoherent decision, for example, striking down student loan forgiveness. They're going to fight very hard on that. They're going to hope that inflation abates, which today's numbers appear to indicate. And if inflation abates and we don't have a serious recession and we keep creating jobs, the truth is that Biden will then be, assuming he runs, in a very strong position for re-election, because he'll not only have the issues we're talking about now, if the Republicans nominate a Trump or a DeSantis, but he'll have an economy that is producing at a level that people really like. Just think Bill Clinton after 1994. Bill Clinton had a much worse midterm than Joe Biden did. Joe Biden had a superb midterm by historical standards, as I outlined at the beginning. Bill Clinton had an appalling midterm. People began to write him off. And then as the economy did better and better and better and better, he basically coasted to re-election in 1996.
Stan asks, yeah, if Republicans are serious about discontinuing funding for Ukraine, what would be the impact of that electorally? Mara?
That's a really good question. There's no doubt that the Republican base is relatively isolationist. There's a lot of pro-Putin sentiment in the Republican right, the MAGA right.
Can you believe, Lamora, I have to interrupt and say, can you believe how Ronald Reagan would react to hearing that?
Yeah, he would turn over in his grave. But the point is that I think Mitch McConnell, assuming he's the minority leader in the Senate, and I think he will be, he wants that funding to continue. I think that the Democrats will have to, pass that kind of funding by themselves with some moderate Republicans. But yes, you're seeing a lot of sentiment in the right wing of the Republican Party, not just against foreign wars, but Ukraine in particular. Remember, Donald Trump's many, many animuses, his top one, foreign policy-wise, was against Ukraine. That's how he got impeached the first time.
All right. One more. We have time for one more question. Let's see. Yeah, go right ahead.
What do you think the future of citizen or nonpartisan redistricting is? Will it happen? And secondly, is it a good campaign issue on a pro-democracy type campaign?
Clarence, do you want to respond to that?
Good campaign issue, terrible issue to persuade incumbents about. Incumbents don't like changing the way that they won their seats or the system by which it was done. But if you turn to, we're starting to see reforms like that in some states. I believe California does districting with a committee,
And you have
right?
top two primaries, yeah.
Yeah, right. But states where the parties are firmly entrenched structurally, why change a system that got you where you are?
But one thing about nonpartisan redistricting, it's a little abstract, it's kind of processy. Voters probably don't think about that. But in states where partisan gerrymandering has gone so far as to entrench minority rule, where the Republicans can get something like 46% of the statewide vote and end up with 70% of the state legislative seats, which is true in places like Wisconsin.
Yep.
I mean, to the extent voters see that as inherently unfair. Why should the guy or the party that gets fewer votes end up with a majority of seats? I mean, it's why the Electoral College, you cannot convince any American that the Electoral College is fair when it diverges from the popular vote. So I think to the extent that all of us are looking at these reforms to make our system fairer, to make sure that we don't morph from minority party rights to minority rule, nonpartisan redistricting is really important. Now, in some states where voters passed nonpartisan redistricting measures by 60%, like Ohio, the Republican legislature just ignored it. So, you know, you have to not only pass it,
you got the Ohio Supreme Court to go along with it.
To go along with it, yeah.
We've got to conclude on that note. Clarence Page, thank you so much. We appreciate you with us.
Thank you.
Mara Eliason, thank you. Bob Schrum,
Thank you.
all so much for being with us. Now, for those of you watching at home, we're going to be switching and bringing out a panel to talk about Southern California election issues. And we'd love to have you watch along wherever you are across the country or around the nation. We're going to have a local panel here on stage at the Skirball Cultural Center. But if you're leaving us after the national program, I just want to remind you that in 2 weeks, the program is dark next week for Thanksgiving week. But in 2 weeks, Wednesday night, coming up 15 days from today, the conversation with Richard Haas, who is the longtime head of the Council on Foreign Relations, in conversation with Warren Olney. That'll be coming up in 2 weeks, that Wednesday night after Thanksgiving, 5 o'clock Pacific, 8 o'clock Eastern. We're going to take a very brief break and we're going to reset the stage for our local conversation. We'll have that for you in just about 5 minutes. And for those of you that are watching at home, thank you so much for continuing on with our program this evening. We're at the Skirball Cultural Center, which is a nonprofit cultural center here in Los Angeles, right between the San Fernando Valley and West Los Angeles, all kinds of great events and exhibitions here at the Skirball. So if you don't live in Southern California, next time you come to Los Angeles, check and see what exhibitions there are here. Always a beautiful place to visit and with a number of outstanding venues. Well, joining us to talk about the local election results is Sonia Diaz, who is the founding director of UCLA's Latino, Latina, Chicano, Chicana Policy and Politics Institute. Sonia, good evening. Also with us is Fernando Guerra, who is professor of political science and Chicano, Chicana studies and Latino, Latina studies at Loyola Marymount University. He also directs LMU's Center for the Study of Los Angeles and is a board member emeritus or life trustee of Southern California Public Radio. So we appreciate that. All the support that Fernando has given us over the years. Pete Peterson is the Dean of the School of Public Policy at Pepperdine University. Thank you so much, Pete, for being here. And my colleague and longtime co-worker, Frank Stoltz, KPCC LAist correspondent on civics and democracy and the host of the fairly recently released podcast, Imperfect Paradise, The Sheriff, Frank Stoltz. So in case you hadn't heard, just a few hours ago, Alex Villanueva, Los Angeles County Sheriff, conceded defeat to Robert Luna, Long Beach former chief of police. Frank, just your thoughts on that. Let's start with that, since you did this multi-part series on Alex Villanueva.
Sure, I attended the news conference and he was typically defiant.
He let you in, though.
It was everybody. Oh, he did let me in, which was surprising.
Yeah, he didn't let the Times in on election night.
Well, yeah, and he didn't miss a chance to scold a reporter. It wasn't me this time, it was somebody else.
Were you hurt that you were left
I
out?
was a little hurt this time. They hadn't read his 600-page rebuttal to the sheriff's decision that his rehiring of Carl Mandoyan was illegal. But they should have read that rebuttal and understood the case better, because he was right and the judge was wrong. But he did concede, and You know, he has always kind of portrayed himself as the white knight, corrupt. He calls the Board of Supervisors a criminal enterprise. So, you know, and a lot of it was sort of out of touch with reality. You know, he really has sort of his own take on things that hardly anyone agrees with him except the deputies union. But that'll be the challenge for the new sheriff, Robert Luna, who's the former police chief of Long Beach, which is a fraction of the size of the sheriff's department. And of course, the sheriff also runs the sprawling jail system.
Well, I was going to say Villanueva had very minimal managerial experience even within the sheriff's department. What was his highest level of?
He was just a lieutenant, which is, you know, deputy sergeant lieutenant. So he never made it into the command structure. Never supervised more than about 100 people.
And then overnight becomes sheriff of the largest sheriff's department in the United States. Sonia, your thoughts about the sheriff's race?
Well, I think it's important because there were in many ways two places for the electorate in the county to vote and to essentially create a level of accountability through their ballot of the sheriff's department, which for most of my lifetime has been mirrored in scandal. Ultimately, not only was Sheriff Villanueva defeated by double digits, over 20 percentage points. And again, he really did not clean house in the primary. Measure A, which was an accountability measure really predicated on families that were impacted by violence and officer-involved shootings, passed 70% to 30%. And this is something that just came onto the ballot this summer, was really grassroots, but there's a clear criminal justice perspective of the electorate in the county, which if you look at Measure R around the jails, Measure J in the wake of the murder of George Floyd about public safety and reimagining it, and now Measure A, accountability. I think a lot of messaging will say, well, Villanueva is already out, why do you need it? But ultimately, we're still a county that had Sheriff Lee Baca.
Well, and why wouldn't you, if you're going to have the Board of Supes able to remove someone for cause, why wouldn't you extend it to other county election officials? Because I think it's hard not to be jaded about, oh yeah, they hate the sheriff, so the Board of Supes put this on the ballot. But why not do it for the DA? Why not do it for other county positions?
You know, that's really interesting, Larry. I feel like I see what's going to happen after Air Talk. You have a nice criminal justice transformation career.
No, it's funny because this so came out of the enmity that the board had for this sheriff. Fernando, your thoughts about this race?
Oh, well, I feel sorry for Frank Stoltz now. He's going to get half the airtime that he used to get. So it's like, I don't know what he's going to.
But the listeners benefit, so they don't have to hear me as.
Oh, to me, it was a foregone conclusion after the primary where 70% of the voters in the primary said, we don't want you. There was no case that I could find in any, not only in LA County history, but in any county in the 58 counties of California where an incumbent got less than 40% of the vote and was able to come back and win. It just doesn't happen. I know we have to be careful with all the indicators. We just saw the discussion at the national level about all these indicators that said there was going to be a red wave and it didn't transpire. But all the metrics said that he was going to lose and lose big, and he did.
Pete Peterson, final thought on the sheriff.
Well, I think it's interesting to see how much of a transformation Villanueva has gone through over the last few years. I mean, he was brought in as the reform-minded sheriff, and to see what's, has happened over the last few years just shows, and it could be indicative of the fact that he had come without much managerial experience and then came into a place where he obviously was overwhelmed and seemed to react to that in an extremely heavy-handed way. I mean, the exploration or sending sheriff's deputies into Supervisor Kuehl's house I think for a lot of people on the outside who had not paid a lot of attention to the race, just thought that just seemed way over the top. And certainly the primary indicated that this result was forthcoming.
So Pete, let's shift our attention to the LA mayor's race, where Karen Bass has about a 5 percentage point lead. It's getting larger with every subsequent county release of ballot totals over Rick Caruso. It would appear very difficult for him now to
to turn the tide on that. What is that going to mean for Los Angeles if Bass is the next mayor?
Well, I think it's fair to say that we are not going to be promised a lot different. Certainly, I think it's fair to say that Bass was much more of an insider candidate as far as relationships with special interests within Los Angeles. I think there hasn't been a lot of proposals about what she would do differently from Garcetti. I think certainly from the perspective of Caruso, he was seen as more of an outsider candidate. Yes, a billionaire, but I would just ask that, it's not as if Karen Bass was running on no money, right? I mean, she was certainly raising funds from, by and large, special interests who have interests in her positions once she becomes mayor, which seems to be forthcoming. But it certainly seems like we're going to see a continuation of many of the policies that we saw going into this race.
She had some very effective ads. Caruso obviously just covered the airwaves and social media with ads. Do you think, Sonia, it's possible that he advertised so much that it turned some people off?
I think that his advertising was really targeted and it was hyper segmented, akin to what the Republican Party was able to do in Florida. So what Caruso did was not only saturate and make big buys for Spanish language in the primaries and in the general, which many candidates don't do. I mean, for Governor Newsom with the recall election, the buys to Univision and Telemundo, from what I understand, were very delayed and very small. But in addition to that, he focused on field and he was hiring people at $35 an hour to knock doors and engage, and really spent a lot of time in East Los Angeles, where Representative Bass, and dare I say, Mayor-elect Bass was not really there on the ground. I do want to counter in terms of much of the same, because LA is very governed by our charter. And with that, the city council has seen tremendous changes in this election cycle and in 2020. And that in many ways is distinct and an opposite to what Garcetti had with both Herb Wesson and Nuri Martinez.
Yeah, Fernando, your thoughts about how Los Angeles might be different, if it will, with Karen Bass as mayor?
Well, kind of in between the two of them here. Number one.
You want to change seats?
No, that's okay. I was like hanging out with Larry. So I would say this. Again, looking at the metrics, a year ago, had you told me that a liberal Democrat from Congress, African-American woman, was going to be one candidate and a billionaire former Republican was going to be the other, I would say, that's easy, man. She's going to win 70-30. But of course, two major intervening variables, $110 million. That's a big variable. But, money doesn't always win. Now, 95% of the time, those who spend more money win, but we've seen Meg Whitman. And even in this election, there was close to $1 billion spent on the propositions, and most of those lost. Big money lost in every single one of the propositions. So, big money doesn't always win, and it's not going to win in the mayoral election. That was one intervening variable, right? The amount of money. The second one is that there is discontent in the city. We pick it up in all the polling that we've been doing at Loyola Marymount University in terms of the direction of the city. And you also pick it up in a variety of different aspects. And people are tired of city government. I'll end with this one fact. Yeah. There are 18 elected officials in the city of Los Angeles, the 15 council members and the three, the mayor, controller, and city attorney. All right. 8 of them ran the 18, 8 of them ran for office and were defeated. Okay. 2 council members were defeated running for re-election. 2 other council members ran for mayor and didn't make it. The city attorney ran for mayor and didn't make it. Another council member ran for controller and didn't make it. The controller ran for statewide office and didn't make it. There was a complete and total rejection of the existing governing class of Los Angeles.
How much of that is because of the multiple cases of corruption, the charges, how much of it is because the sense the quality of life in the city generally, homelessness, crime, those factors?
I think they were both very important, and you just again take a look and see that people are fed up to some extent. Karen Bass should have won this election by 60 to 65%. She's going to end up winning about 55%. Okay, that's it's going to be about 10 points. Is that a mandate? In heavily one-party Democratic LA, that's not a mandate. You know, she underperformed by about 10 percentage points because she represents the existing governing class in Los Angeles, the liberal democratic regime, which I have supported and voted for every single time, right? However, we have not met the moment of homelessness, have not met the moment, and people took a second look in this heavily democratic city. And we turned to some moderates like Caruso, but we also turned to some incredible progressives. The amount of progressives, they overperformed in this election as never before, and they will define LA politics going into the future.
And Pete, I wanted to ask you, to what do we attribute this progressive wave in Los Angeles politics? Do we see enough of a demographic shift? Is it about younger LA voters coming out? What's driving this?
Well, I have to say, I was really pretty surprised at some of the results, in large part because this was really the first citywide election since COVID. And we did, in response to COVID statewide, have a recall election for governor, which was really predicated on COVID response. That obviously was not ultimately successful. But I have to say, I really was surprised to see that there wasn't more of an accountability for essentially the ruling class that we have seen within, even given many of the changes that we're talking about. But I would have thought that there would have been more a yearning for the outsider, especially in this mayor's race, even given the underperforming, which Dr. Guerra, I certainly do take that point, but I really did think that there was going to be more of a seeking of accountability for the closure of schools, the closure of businesses, and what we've seen in some other areas about a really aggressive response to COVID.
Frank, I wanted to ask you about.
I'm just going to bounce off of that and say that, some of the traditional institutions that people look to and trusted, like the Democratic Party, aren't trusted as much. So you saw in the controller's race, I mean, the party backed Koretz, and you're right, he was an incumbent, or seen like as an incumbent maybe in that race to some extent because he's councilman. But also he had the backing of the Democratic Party, didn't win. The same thing happened in a couple other races, Mitch O'Farrell in the 13th. The other institution that didn't fare so as well as they have in the past are the law enforcement unions. They spent big on Hertzberg for a supervisor in the 3rd district. And it looks like Hertzberg, that race has been called? Hertzberg is trailing. The trend has been toward Horvath. Yeah. I mean, if there's one race that ALADS, the deputies union, invested in, it was in Hertzberg. They were much more interested in getting him on the board of supervisors than they were in getting Sheriff Villanueva reelected. And we also saw big police spending for Mitch O'Farrell. Didn't work. We saw Koretz, announce a bunch of his discretionary funds going to the LAPD in the final weeks of the campaign. Sort of that classic, like I'm taking my discretionary funds and giving it to the cops, hoping that would get votes and maybe bail them out. Didn't. So I found that kind of interesting. And one more point, I'm wondering, and I'm curious what everyone else thinks. In the post, I've been covering law enforcement a lot. And I think about sort of the post-Ferguson era, the post-George Floyd era, and if in some ways, this progressive movement that we've seen hasn't been propelled, by the new critique of law enforcement.
Yeah, very good point. Sonia.
I'd love to chime in because I think part of this is the genesis. In many ways, we're still in COVID. We're in the flu season. We're in Jesus, all of the different things. But with that, some points of clarification. The recall petition for Governor Newsom predated COVID, was focused on homelessness, was focused in some ways, had some xenophobic undertones, and then also really wanting a different level of criminal justice than what the voters in Los Angeles and ultimately the voters statewide. We found at UCLA that from a 3-to-1 margin, Latino voters rejected the recall. This was not because of really strong ground game or messaging to Latino voters, it was because of trusted messengers. And in this case, this was community clinics, immigrant rights organizations, nonprofits in critical areas, the San Fernando Valley, the Inland Empire, the Central Valley. As it relates to the county, what's really important here is voters are tired. They said that they would tax themselves to build housing, Measure H, Measure HH. And yet the problem has gotten worse. At the same time, in terms of racial reckoning with our criminal justice system, the voters have had 3 measures. They've also, for the first time, defeated an incumbent sheriff who then was defeated, making him the second incumbent, back-to-back elections for the county sheriff's office. DA Lacey was defeated by George Gascon. Gascon overcame recalls. The trend line is clear. People want to invest in data-backed measures for safer communities. They want a right to be able to stay in the city. And what I think is so fascinating is that Caruso's initial messages, in addition to having family roots in Boyle Heights and Los Angeles, was the broken windows policing. Kenneth Mejia's message was the inequity in terms of our city budget to policing versus every single other service. Kenneth Mejia received the most vote share of any citywide elected official in this context.
How much of that do you really think was voters knowing that message? It's not like he had a lot of ads out there saying what he was running for. Insiders knew, but your typical voter, did they even know what Kenneth Mejia was running on? Or was it the fact that he was running against someone that they were pushing away? And in a sense, it was a vote against the establishment in voting for him.
Well, I think that his message was that he was against the establishment.
But did people hear that? That what I'm asking is, does the typical voter hear from a controller candidate? Did they really hear that?
They heard something different. And I think some of the
I saw
messages.
the name was someone who had not been a councilman.
Well, it wasn't just that Mejia was different. It was that this was a controller that actually had a CPA as background. This was a controller for whom his key messaging was about budget, that his campaign wasn't just about mailers, it was creating new product development to interact with how the budget is made. He was in many ways engaging participatory governance in his election. Mind you, this is, I think, the 3rd time he was a candidate. And if you take the Mejia as a case study, it goes back to Bernie Sanders. And so where are we at right now? In 2020, Bernie Sanders was the choice for the Democratic primary in 2020 for California voters. That was also true of Latino voters. So I see there's this shift that is both demographics, but is also not waiting your turn.
Fernando, what do you think?
I mean, in all the polling that we've been doing at Loyola Marymount University, we do polls all the time. Every year we do the largest annual poll in urban America. And it is clear that LA is increasingly progressive. And I've been making the argument that both the residents and the voters are more progressive than the ruling class, the liberal Democrats, and it's just manifesting itself now. Part of the reason it's manifesting is that we've moved these local elections from the odd year, low turnout, to the gubernatorial year, right? And part of the argument against that was, oh, people won't pay attention to the mayor's race, et cetera. More people are paying attention and voting for the mayor's race than for the governor's race in the city of LA. It's receiving more votes than any other election. And so this, just to give you an example, Nithya Raman, very progressive. She won in the 4th district. It was the first time that all the even numbered council districts were up in an even number. During the presidential election, we had 70% turnout. Okay. In that district, we had 70% turnout. The year before, the last time they had an election, it was 11%.
Wow.
It went from 11% to 70% by moving the election to 11 to, right? This mayoral election will produce the largest number of votes in LA mayoral history. This one today, right? More than any time in the history of LA, there will be more voters, 930,000 about people will vote for mayor of LA. The previous record was in 1969, Yorty versus Bradley, which was about 820. And so this is a very significant. The first time we had it in the even year, the first time we had universal vote by mail, the first time we had vote centers, et cetera, et cetera. It worked. People are coming out. More progressives are coming out.
All right. Let's talk about what the new LA City Council will mean policy-wise. Sam Yebri conceding earlier today to Katie Young-Yaroslavsky in the 5th District. Tracy Park continues to lead Aaron Darling in the 11th by about 7.5 percentage points. Hugo Soto Martinez, the challenger, 9-point lead over incumbent Mitch O'Farrell. So O'Farrell conceded earlier this evening in the 13th. And Tim McOsker, nearly doubling Danielle Sandoval's total in the 15th district. So Frank, what is this going to mean in your view for the kinds of actions this new council will take?
Well, then you have a special election to replace Nuri Martinez coming up after her resignation. And if Kevin De Leon resigns, then you have another special election. The turnover is extraordinary. And as we know, it's a weak mayor system. So there's a lot of power in the council. So what does it mean for policy? We're not going to have a police department that's going to grow to what Caruso wanted, 11,000. I don't know if it would have grown to that anyway, you know, given the budget constraints.
Well, and can they even hire that many people? They can't hire enough to even fill the spaces they've got because people don't want to go into law enforcement.
That's right, for all sorts of reasons, including the economy, and it's a tougher profession than ever. But what does it mean for policy? Obviously, I'm going to agree with Fernando. It's a more progressive council now. If you start adding up the votes, you need to get to 8. And I think you're going to have 6 progressives, maybe 7. And you can bet the progressives are going to turn out for the Nuri Martinez replacement election. You know, I think I'm not sure. So in terms of police policy, you know, I think they're going to push forward on some of the pilot programs, which Garcetti already announced he's going to expand. But I think we'll see more of those types of programs where you get non-armed officers to take care of certain kinds of calls, like mental health calls, maybe limit their role in traffic stops, stuff like that. But beyond that, I'm not sure. I'll defer to others on what sort of sweeping policy changes.
What do you expect to see?
Well, I think it's fair to say that if the issues that are in the minds of most Angelenos are homelessness, crime, and cost of living, I'm not sure that I've seen a set of policy proposals that are going to effectively address that. I mean, essentially, we're moving into a grand experiment right now in Los Angeles policy. Voters have obviously spoken for a more progressive city council, and have also seen that, even though there are a lot of varying factors on the sheriff's race, but it's fair to say that they're looking for a more reform-minded sheriff. But the proof is going to be in the pudding. If crime goes up, if homelessness persists, if cost of living remains a challenge for most Angelenos, then voters are again going to look to hold their political officials accountable. But it's fair to say that, at least in the mayor's race, and certainly what I'm hearing from some of these council members that have now been elected, that they're looking to take a more progressive stance on criminal justice reform, and certainly looking to take what could be described to be a more progressive stance on homelessness.
Let's talk about the potential for new council policies. For example, expansion, the number of council members. That's something that's been pushed. Unclear whether voters will accept that. The other is moving to independent redistricting. Pete, do you think coming out of the racist tape recording being released, that and the underbelly of redistricting being exposed, that we might end up seeing an independent process?
Well, full disclosure, we at Pepperdine, we have an institute called the Davenport Institute for Public Engagement, and we've consulted on both independent redistricting as well as citizens initiative review. So I am a huge fan of citizens redistricting, and certainly would support that coming to Los Angeles. So I think it's been a great thing for California. It's kind of the ultimate in public engagement. It's one of the only good lines, I think, from then Governor Schwarzenegger, is that in redistricting, the politicians get to select both sides of the, get to draw their own districts. And I think in this instance that these recordings may trigger. I know that there are some activist groups that I'm actually speaking with that are looking to move forward, or at least propose. I know that District Attorney Fuhrer is also seems to be
City
supportive
attorney, yeah.
of a citizens redistricting group as well.
Yeah, and one of the things so interesting is in the congressional races, of course, we saw in Orange County a dominant Asian American district centered in the Vietnamese American communities of Little Saigon, and then connecting up to two other Asian population centers. I don't think you ever would have seen that, Sonia, under politician-drawn maps. It was really the citizens taking that input from people in those Orange County and part of it LA County communities saying, yeah, we want to keep that cohesive.
Well, and to that point, that was one of the things, in full disclosure, I sat on the Los Angeles City Council Redistricting Commission that the commission was really clear about, which was making Koreatown whole and not slicing it across 4 council districts for that same reason. I think that, there's pros and cons. There's a lot of cons in the redistricting process in the city and with LAUSD that needs to be addressed. To your point about expansion, I authored a report really comparing the city of Los Angeles to other jurisdictions in the state of California and the major cities, thinking about the districting scheme that we have here and making the argument that it's disadvantages city residents because we're in a county with 2 million constituents to each supervisor, but because of the topography, the geography, and the demography of Los Angeles, such that you have the islands of West Hollywood, you have the narrow 110 freeway down to San Pedro, you have these distinct enclaves. And if it's really around power that continues to be unrepresentative demographically, expansion of the council can provide that nuance, close the gap between constituents and elected officials, and create new Asian opportunity districts.
It would be interesting to see, because LA is a comparatively strong council, the mayor, and I know Fernando, you make the point, it's not as weak as people say it is, but compared to, say, mayor of New York or Chicago, it is. This just in, Donald Trump has just announced he is running for president.
You guys should all be happy about that. It almost ensures a Democratic victory.
Yeah, certainly Democratic politicians, I think, would see that as a gift. So Fernando, if you expand the council and it's a comparatively strong council, what does that mean?
Well, I'm actually gonna answer the question that was asked a couple of times ago and then get back to this, okay, about public policy in Los Angeles. Karen Bass has the opportunity to be the greatest mayor of Los Angeles. And think about Joe Biden, someone who knows politics and knows how to negotiate, knows how to be a conciliatory person, inclusive, number one, has experience, right? Number two, has a progressive wing that is pulling you, like Biden, right? And then number three, has money, okay? Biden spent a lot of money, very well spent. We just passed in California the largest tax increase by far in the history of the city. Proper measure ULA will raise anywhere from 600 million to $1 billion a year. It's not a bond measure, it's actual money coming to the city every single year. She now has $1 billion a year for the next 4 years to spend on homelessness.
How many units will that buy in LA at $700,000 a unit?
Right? But it could be used differently. Exactly.
Yeah, it's not going to go too far.
She now has progressives who want to do that. And it sets her up. And I agree with Pete in the campaign. It was frustrating listening to both Caruso and Bass talk about homelessness. Half the time I kept saying, you can't even do that because that's not within the city's purview, et cetera. But irrespective of what they said in the campaign, she now has the resources, I believe, the experience and the council that's pushing in that direction to do some fantastic stuff.
So what would they do though, realistically? for you?
Realistically,
I mean, it sounds great, but what would they do?
no, they have the ability to invest 50 million per project. They have the ability, instead of building projects, to buy existing projects so they don't have to wait. What was also remarkable about this measure is that it not only is the largest tax increase, not only in the history of LA, I believe it's the largest tax increase in the history of municipal government in America, is that it takes the power away from the mayor we were talking about and gives it to the general manager of the housing department. He or she, it's currently a she, gets to make these kind of decisions. And it takes away the power from the city council that they can't reject it. There's a new advisory board, also 15 members.
And
It's amazing, and we hardly talked about it. It's revolutionary.
So if they can build all this, it'll be a great test also of whether providing housing solves homelessness.
That's correct. In other words, we've given this new mayor everything to be able to address the issue. If they cannot do this in 4 years, it will be not only a failure of Mayor Bass, but of the liberal democratic regime in governing Los Angeles. And we have to go either more progressive or back to the moderates.
Let's talk a bit about the state of California because
Can I answer the question
Yeah,
about
sure.
independent redistricting?
Yeah.
Yes. So you have full disclosure. You have full disclosure.
I'm waiting.
Yeah, full disclosure. We have gotten together with about 6 or 7 academics. We should bring you in on what we're talking about. We're putting together a committee of academics with a community to bring a proposal for redistricting funded by several foundations. About 6 or 7 LA-based foundations said, we cannot trust the city to do this process on their own. Let's get the best academics. So we have the dean of the Luskin School, your boss, the chair of the political science department at USC, and about 5 other academics.
How many women academics?
The chair of the political science department at USC, I would say about half of them are. Okay, yeah. So Ange Marie Hancock Alfaro, who is the
that's some strong people.
yes, and Rafe Sonnenschein is really one of the leads of this, to then put together the plan on how to establish a new independent redistricting commission. And of course, the city is going to want to wait. And by the way, it's a charter. You got to change the charter. So we have to vote on that.
Okay.
And it can't be until 24.
I need to move on to the state, but I love your passion for the city. But I want to talk about what we saw with the ballot propositions and some of you were part of that conversation that we did. And we only saw 3 of those ballot props, Pete, pass. The constitutional amendment enshrining abortion and contraception rights. And then we had the flavored tobacco and vape products and 1% for the arts and music out of school funding. So what's your analysis of all the money that was spent? Only 3 of those passed.
Well, again, when you're running these cross-cutting measures, there's first, as we know from history, most California voters will turn down most ballot propositions, right? And so this understanding, especially when you get cross-cutting ones on the gambling, I think most voters just kind of threw their hands up and said, no gambling, I'm not going to support either one of those. The dialysis measure, it just seems to be the constant, one that gets.
Third time wasn't the charm.
No, but if
it's like Christy Smith.
But you wonder if there were other reasons why the unions in particular keep putting that measure out there. If I was running DaVita, I would probably know that I'm going to have to come up with another $100 million next time around, because I think that's just going to be something else. So I think voters on an array of those measures, except for those ones that they passed, they were either too similar to one another and were essentially kind of threw their hands up. But certainly the one that I think was pretty profound, especially as someone who's on the right side of the aisle and who's pro-life, was to see the significant passage of the Prop 1 measure. Now, that's not to say that there still isn't an opening there for the shaping of that within the legislature, but suffice it to say, it was a significant victory for the pro-choice side of that equation.
And of course, for
Okay.
Gavin Newsom's run for president, right?
Yeah, and what do you all
He
think?
used that as, yeah.
Yeah, we talked in the first hour about Newsom and our three national guests kind of poo-pooed him being a candidate, even if Biden doesn't run or isn't able to run, that they don't really see Newsom as a front of the pack candidate. What do you think?
Oh, no, I mean, every single governor of California thinks he ought to be president, except for Schwarzenegger, since he was foreign born. But
He would have, I'm sure.
oh, he wanted to be president, but yeah. So no, I think Newsom had a phenomenal election. No, he had been reelected back in September when he beat the recall. But think about Proposition 30. That was the only one that I wasn't sure whether it was going to pass or not. That was the one about climate change and funding electric cars and taxing millionaires, something that you think we would have all supported, but it went down to defeat, mostly because of him. He said, this is wrong way to do it. And so
He framed it as an Uber initiative.
right, exactly.
Or Lyft, I should
right.
say Lyft.
And then I
yes.
also think the way he went out and instead of campaigning against his opponent, who most of us can't even remember his name, and the election was only last week, is that he went and campaigned in Florida and in Texas. And that was really smart in a sense. I can't battle against this, small little guy. I got to go fight somebody my own size, meaning, Florida and Texas.
Well, that leads us
yeah.
then to the Republican Party in California, Pete. What would it take? Lonnie Chen,
Yeah.
who had the endorsements of all the major newspapers, and was the Republican who seemed that he had the best shot at winning a statewide office for controller.
Absolutely.
But Malia Cohen just overwhelmed him with votes. So how does the Republican Party, or can it regain relevance?
Well, obviously, and Lonnie's a friend, again, in disclosure, and he conceded this afternoon. So just, that race is over. Again, I think one of the challenges that you have in a one-party state is you have these races where, frankly, we're not, as Californians, if we can think about that as opposed to our partisan labels, and I may be the only Republican in this room right now, I can say that Californians are not going to be well served in that controller's office. I mean, the newspapers were right on that. When you, at the LA Times and the San Francisco Chronicle and the Sacramento Bee, they're choosing Lonnie Chen to be the next controller. I think the fact that we did not get that because, frankly, most people don't know the controller's race. They didn't know either one of those two candidates. They're simply
And
going.
that's not
R
unusual.
or T.
That's typical for a down ballot.
Of
race
course,
like that.
but it's an important office, right? And so in that, again, I would say that it is certainly a challenge. I love this state, but this past week and the results, and to know people like Lonnie, Lance Christensen's a buddy of mine. He ran for superintendent of California schools. I would argue that Tony Thurmond is essentially a tool of the teachers' unions. I don't think I don't think we overall as Californians benefit from a one-party state.
Yeah, and there are probably even a fair number of Democrats in this room who would agree with that, who would like to see a strong Republican Party because of the excesses that come with one-party rule. So what would it take for the Republican Party to be more attractive to Californians, to not make it an undesirable label to run as a Republican?
Well, I think it's going to take two things. One is it's going to continue to take people like Lonnie Chen to run knowing that they're probably going to lose. I mean, I did that in my race back in 2014. I knew I was probably going to lose for Secretary of State, but I was passionate about the issues, and it's going to take courage on the part of Republicans who otherwise know in their heads that they're probably going to lose, but have to think in their hearts if they believe that they're the right candidate for the office to continue to run. The other thing is, if there isn't a misstep by the predominant party in the state, i.e. the Democrats, then there's not going to be an opening created. So in an instance like this, there has to be an opening created where the Democrats overreach. They get too progressive in the eyes of a broader, obviously a majority of voters. That's what it's going to have to take. But if that doesn't happen, if the Democrats do not overreach in the eyes of most voters, then they're just going to continue to win.
Yeah. Well, let's take some questions from members of our audience who'd like to talk about state or local politics. Where do we have a microphone up here? Yes.
On the homelessness issue, I know that that was obviously on the top of people's mind, but it seems like it's a much more complicated issue than just building more housing units. I mean, there's federal rules in play, there's mental health issues in play, there's drug addiction issues in play. There's just so many things that I think we're approaching this as a super simplistic, like we're just gonna tax our ways out of this and keep building more units, but I don't see that as really fixing the problem. I guess.
So I want to interject because there's a lot of truth in that, right? Policy, unfortunately, and governance is set up to be siloed, and there's ways where life doesn't work that way. You can't just put somebody in a corner. One of the things about the homeless count in Los Angeles, which is point in time, they have to find people, is that it found that there was a 26% increase in Latino homelessness. Again, the county and the city of Los Angeles are majority Latino. What that means, Latinos being a youthful demographic like Asian Americans, 6 out of 10 Latinos are millennial or younger. That increase is really thinking about households, and it's including children and families. And so when we talk about building housing, it's not singular housing. We need to think about family housing. When you talk about drug addiction or mental health, we're talking about crime and the police and the DA and the city attorney. And ultimately, the future of the city, and I'm really excited. I feel like the changes are like the Lakers, right? We just need LeBron to get the right team, and we're back in the 90s.
That may not be the analogy you want to use today. But,
The
just like the
1990s
Rams of the
Lakers.
Super Bowl era.
But ultimately the resources are there because this is happening under a Biden administration that's been prolific in terms of investment. And Bass said it and really chastised her local and municipal colleagues by saying we had to send $100 million back that you didn't spend on homelessness. It's about doing the work together. And COVID showed us that we have a long way to go in Los Angeles.
Well, and we've of course had the critique, Frank, that Los has had of the county and the city not playing nice with each other, and the other challenge I think is we had on Air Talk yesterday a conversation about methamphetamine and how the growth in use of cheap and highly potent methamphetamine has interacted with homelessness. And I still hear a lot of our elected officials talking about it as though it's a housing problem, and that's really and once you get people into housing, then you get them drug treatment, then things will be fine. And I just wonder, is there any change taking place, any appetite to see this as more complex, and that not all unhoused people are the same?
Well, I think we have to point out that the city does a lot of the building of housing, and the county almost exclusively provides the social services. So that'll be interesting to see how LA City housing, as it builds housing, interacts with the county in terms of providing what they call wraparound supportive services. Karen Bass has huge challenges. She's never served in an executive position. I mean, she did run the Community Coalition for a while, which is a small South LA grassroots community group. But she's got to bring in the right people. And frankly, there were critiques about her campaign, certainly early on, that she didn't run it very well, that she was indecisive, that she didn't do her homework. I'm sure this is going to be not a small challenge for Karen Bass. And it's these kinds of details when you're building housing and what kind of services are you going to provide and how are you going to work with the county to do that. To answer your question, I think certainly among all of us, there's fatigue. But there are several pilot programs where they do offer supportive services. I mean, there's a lot of thinking about all of that going on at the county in particular, but also to some extent the city. So the thinking is out there, the ideas are out there. You know, we'll see if a Bass administration can administer it. We have someone on this side of the room? Yes. Can you wait till we get your microphone turned on? Because it's hard to hear you. Yeah, let's get that mic on here.
Hello?
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, I was elected for 2 years as the, a part of the neighborhood council in Venice. And
I'm sorry, can you turn her mic up a little bit? I'm having a little trouble hearing. Yeah,
Oh, my master, okay.
yeah. And hold it close to your mouth, please.
All right, so I was elected for 2 years at the neighborhood council in Venice. And I just dedicated myself to the homeless problem. I had two subjects, the homeless problem and the trash problem.
So just one question, what is it?
And at the time, Rosendahl was.
Oh, hold on. One question, please.
Okay, I'm coming to the question. I have to give the background. So I noticed that Rosendahl, who was, the council person for Brentwood and Venice, and
Yeah, I'm sorry, I have to break up. We don't have time for a big one.
This is why.
What is the question specifically? Don't give the back.
What would it take to increase the number of council people? They
right.
definitely need much more because we were doing the work.
Sonia,
for them.
what would it take to do that?
It would take a charter amendment that would be voted by the city residents that can vote. And this occurred almost 20 years ago and was rejected, but we're in a totally different landscape that has had an electoral capacity to be open to big major changes.
And I want to ask, can I ask a question? I mean, you guys are all excited, Fernando, you in particular, about this new academic effort with foundations to propose redistricting commission. But can there really be a serious shift in power, a better distribution of power without an expansion of the council?
Land use has to be part of it, but no. And so this is the reason I had this awesome experience to get to know my city in a way that I didn't and listen to so many residents. There were clear calls from the community of Watts that they didn't want to be in City Council 15. San Pedro does not have enough people to comply with the US Constitution, but for going north on the 110. There were places here where people wanted to be unified, the Greater Wilshire Neighborhood Council. There was data that showed huge growth in the San Fernando Valley predicated on Latino population growth, yet Latinos remain stifled in terms of Latino majority districts. And ultimately, there was something else that was really important, which is that in the county is responding to other places, whether it is West Covina or it's Pasadena or it's Whittier. They're not responding to Angelenos. So Angelenos kind of get the double burden of not having direct constituent responses from their supervisor. And then on top of that, being one of 260,000 people for their city council member.
My concern, I think, might be if I'm an Angelino who wants to see changes in my community is if you expand the size of the council, it'll be easier to get the council person's attention, but they have less power. Instead of being one of 15, they're going to be one of however many.
Well, they have to
members
get to work and not vote alike like they've been doing the last cycles. And when I talk about the Lakers, I'm saying as a little girl, the city council would have all out debates. There were more women on the city council, and I come back from law school and we had one. So no,
but the board of supervisors are
which we didn't talk about. So the voters of the county maintained a historic all-female county board of supervisors with Horvath winning and beating Hertzberg. Similarly, the San Fernando Valley, again, very important state senate. They're going to send Caroline Menjivar over Hertzberg Jr. to the state senate.
Yeah, but back to Frank's question, does an independent redistricting commission change power? Absolutely. The data is overwhelming that an independent commission will increase Latino power for sure. That's what happened in California. We now have 13 Latinos in the congressional delegation that before redistricting was independent, there was only 4. You see it in the state legislature as well. The County Board of Supervisors has an independent redistricting commission and now created another heavily Latino district, and there'll be 2 Latinos on there. So yes, absolutely, an independent redistricting commission will redistribute power for Latinos, for Asians, for Democrats.
about
as we saw in
expansion?
Michigan. Well, that's the second part, right? And so it's overwhelming, and it's a foregone conclusion that there will be an independent redistricting commission in Los Angeles, because the state legislature could do it. We don't even have to take it to charter reform, just like what they did for the county. The second part is expansion. Of course, expansion creates more democracy and opportunities, but going back to Larry's point, it becomes, the larger it is, the less powerful it is vis-a-vis the mayor. That's why we have it in Chicago and in New York. Those city councils, 45 and 50, are very weak compared to the mayor. Very weak.
Pete, you were going to say something about that?
No, I was just going to say, you get to that place where, depending on how much you increase, you are essentially watering down the power of individual council members vis-a-vis the mayor. So
We have time for one more question. Yes.
Yeah, hi. My question is to the lone Republican who was upset about the state of California. The Republican Party dug its grave about 10, 20 years ago with Proposition 187 against the Latino community, against the LGBT community, and so forth. So here is just there.
But I'm still living here.
What's the question? Between the blue states and the red states, you look at Maryland.
Oh,
and
hold on. What is your
Massachusetts.
question, sir? What is your question?
I'm trying to help.
Well,
the-
I'm asking you to ask a
Have
question.
you
We're not
looked at-
asking for your political.
I am asking the question right now.
What is the
As-
question?
Is not Maryland and Massachusetts two liberal blue states who voted for Republican governors?
Yeah.
Wouldn't you think that that might be a way to increase Republicans here in California? Moderate, sensible Republicans.
Yeah, I mean, again, if you look at almost across the board, the Republicans that have lost statewide, certainly going back through the last several gubernatorial races. I mean, I think that the composition, I hear this a lot, the composition of the California electorate is a lot different than Maryland and Massachusetts. And for some of the reasons that you point out about Prop 187, it is a much more ethnically diverse electorate here than it is in those places. So if a Republican were to win statewide, say in a gubernatorial election, would that person have to be a moderate? Probably. But again, I think it's going to have to be, elections are all about matchups, right? It's not just who you are, it's who you're running against. And I think it is going to take, it's going to have to take a significant either demonstration that highly progressive policies on the issues that matter, crime, homelessness, cost of living, do not work. That's going to have to be proven. And there's going to have to be a candidate that's going to have to be shown. And if the lights go off, if we're not able to keep the lights on in the state, I'd see a good chance for Republicans to win.
For those of you watching at home, we're seeing bizarre lighting effects in the room at the Skirball Cultural Center. So someone must be playing with a dial somewhere. And now we're sitting in darkness on the stage. So this is very, very strange. We have.
This is very scary.
Wow.
I didn't do it.
I forgot my sunscreen.
Do it.
Is there a middle? See, this is the problem, Larry. Extremes in our politics. We've got to find a middle ground here.
No, but you know, here's the problem with the Republican Party. In Orange County, by the way, there was a red wave in Orange County. Newsom lost Orange County. Remember 4 years ago, they were all Democrats in the congressional delegation.
The Board of Supervisors,
et cetera.
Democrat.
But even there, you elected 2 women to Congress who were somewhat moderate, Kim and Steele,
Michelle
right?
Steele.
And Michelle Steele.
Young Kim.
I would consider them moderate Democrats. But in this election,
Republicans.
excuse me, moderate Republicans, they were moderate Republicans, they got elected, et cetera, great. But in this election cycle, you hear them talk, they like took extreme positions again. They went far right when I like, why did you need to do that when you were, it boggled my mind. I mean, the anti-communism stuff that they talked about, it was like, you had the beginning of a base of moderate Republicans and they couldn't help themselves. They went far right.
We need to conclude the program. My thanks to my colleague Frank Stoltz of KPCC, Pete Peterson at Pepperdine University, Sonia Diaz, UCLA, Fernando Guerra, Loyola Marymount University. For those of you who've been watching at home, thank you so much for being with us. To those of you here at the Skirball, thank you for coming out and being with us tonight. And again, coming up 2 Wednesdays away, week after Thanksgiving, Richard Haas, head of the Council on Foreign Relations, in conversation with Warren Olney, 5 o'clock Pacific time on Zoom. You'll get the invitation. Thanks for joining us.